most of these items on the menu are simply ideologies. None, except for psychedelics, I would submit, are an experience, a direct experience. And this is what gives it a leg up. It's not an appeal to reason. It's not an appeal to reason. And in fact, it is ultimately unreasonable. You know, Tertullian, when he was asked about the resurrection, they said, you know, why do you believe in this? It's so stupid. And he said, credo te absurdum. I believe it because it is absurd. I believe it because it is absurd. This is a thoroughly modern sentiment. If the rest of the fathers of the early church had been as hip as that statement, we wouldn't have come away with original sin and the virgin birth. I believe that there is very little time left, that history is the enunciation of human morphogenetic transformation that is under the control of the largest control structures in the planetary ecology. In other words, it's not up to Bill Clinton or Skink Gingrich or any of these reptiles. It is not a matter of human decision. It is built into the dynamics of the planet. And consequently, all this Western breast-beating and blame-taking about what we did and how we fucked up and all this is a bunch of nonsense. Nobody screwed up. You have to have an enormous sense of your own self-importance to believe that you got away from the control of nature and against her wishes were able to set the planet up for Armageddon. I mean, it's such a typical Western fantasy of freedom and opportunity to do evil. History is not evil. It's misguided and messy and very redundant and iterative, but it isn't evil. For some reason, 12, 10, 15,000 years ago, the human family divided into two camps. The sacred, ritual, eternal, shamanic style of existence, which lived lightly on the land and was tribal and non-technologically based, and our style, which was a style of conquest and denial, virtual reality building. I mean, now this is thought to be the technological edge, but the earliest technology for virtual reality implementation was language, followed quickly by the hard wiring we call urbanization. You know, once you have an urban setting, you are walking around inside of virtual reality. This is an ideology that has been turned into matter. It's as virtual as anything could possibly be. There is nothing new about setting up symbols and taking them for truth. I mean, this seems to be our unique curse, as it were. What the psychedelics do is decondition us from all the media-induced ratios of perception and value systems, and then you just see that culture is just some story that a bunch of people got together. All culture. Doesn't matter whether you're rainforest pygmies or, Japanese bankers or whoever you are. Your story is just some story that, has a certain amount of drama, a certain amount of self-congratulation, a certain amount of risk, and it keeps thought away, that story. But if we dissolve our cultural story, then we discover, what it is that we've been ignoring for 20,000 years, which is the nature of nature, that it preserves novelty, that it is an engine for the production of complexity, that this complexity extends from the abiotic realm into the biotic, into the cultural, into the technological, seamlessly, with no ontological break or transformation. Shamans have a number of abilities which are thought to indicate their special status. They can predict the weather. They can tell where the game has gone. They are very adept at seeing into little social hassles, like who's sleeping with whom that they shouldn't be, or who stole the chicken. And then, most importantly, shamans can cure, or, to put it slightly more cynically, shamans have an incredible ability to choose clients that get well. Well, which is not to knock them. I mean, any doctor will tell you this is part of being a good doctor. So, if you analyze these abilities, you see that they go from being miraculous and mysterious to being trivial and straightforward if you assume that the shamans can see forward into time in a way that ordinary people can't. Well, then where the game went, next week's weather, who's sleeping with who, and who will get well, become trivial. No big deal. And so the charge that shamans are tricksters is in a sense true, except that the trick is not an illusion. It's a real trick. They really can project their consciousness into hyperspace. And thinking about this and thinking about the psychedelic experience, I think this is a partial clue to how to unravel our dilemma in being. Because, here's an analogy from chemistry. You've all probably took chemistry in high school. You know how sulfur has two melting points. Sulfur we think of as a yellow powder. But put it in a spoon and heat it, and it will turn to a black liquid. Keep heating it, and that black liquid will turn to a black solid. Continue heating it, and that black liquid and that black solid will turn back into a liquid. Sulfur has two melting points. This is a very curious property of some forms of matter. It seems to me it suggests an analogy about our own consciousness, which is, consciousness is a kind of omnidirectional threat detection and assessment system that a very paranoid and small monkey put in place in a grassland environment frequented by very large hunting cats. And so the purpose of consciousness is to inform you of something horrific about to happen, that in the hope that you can then take some action against it. But in the bottom of a cave, or high up in a tree, or on a small island, or somewhere where you feel safe, if you will then intoxicate yourself with psychedelics, the evolutionarily defined and paranoid threat detection configuration of consciousness breaks down, and you discover that you have an angel inside your head. And this angel is the non-paranoid, non-carnivorous monkey who is still, nevertheless, you. And that from this angelic point of perception, both the past and the future have an immediacy, a co-presence with the moment that they lack in ordinary experience. And I believe that as we create a non-paranoid world, a loving world, a world where people can operate in an atmosphere of trust of each other, that consciousness is slowly trying to relax and recast itself. And the grease for these skids is, of course, the psychedelic experience, because it forces this dissolving of cultural values. It catalyzes it. What it might take you 40 years to do through a process of rational analysis and psychotherapy and deconstruction and so forth and so on, it can happen literally overnight on a sufficiently alarming dose of a psychedelic substance. The reason I'm willing to speak to this is because I think it's not without reason that in this final moment of historical culmination, that our inventorying of the life and customs of this planet has brought to our attention then these Aboriginal practices, because they are the other half of the equation. What we have brought forward is little truths like energy equals mass times the velocity of light squared, so forth and so on. We are the masters of matter and energy, but not the masters of our own dreams, our own spiritual striving. For that, we are going to have to infuse our sense of technical accomplishment with the heart, basically. The heart that these Aboriginal cultures have kept intact. The next few years are going to be wild and woolly, wilder and woollier than anything we have seen so far. This tendency of things to appear to be getting both better and worse is going to be itself exacerbated tremendously. And people who have outmoded or silly or incomplete or insufficient models of reality are going to find themselves running very, very hard to catch up with a rising sense of anxiety. I think it's going to necessitate a discussion about time's direction, the meaning of history, the meaning of the presence of messianic and utopian visions in our shamanic and spiritual legacy. And I am convinced that the best thing we can do to help this along is to argue against anxiety, inform people concerning the shamanic technologies that are available to them, and urge people to have faith in the larger dynamical processes that define the universe. The universe has been at this game a long, long time. It knows what it is about far better than do we. And if we wish to align ourselves with cosmic purpose, we have to find out what it is. And to find out what it is, we have to go outside of our cultural values and our programming. And we are not, fortunately, without helpers, without aids. The plants have always been there. They are the repositories of this transforming gnosis. And if we avail ourselves of it, we can overcome the dis-ease of culture and begin to function for each other as we should, which is as nodes of transformative information and domains of permission, surrender, and affirmation that recover the real meaning of humanness that history has tended to mitigate and betray. That's what I have to say this afternoon. It's 10 after 4. Thank you, and I'll do questions. So, questions. Sure. The question is about ayahuasca and its ability to heal the body and the mind. In a way, the question is just a continuation of what we've been talking about, because ayahuasca is one of these aboriginal hallucinogens that has arrived on the menu of Western culture right when we need it. Ayahuasca is made of a large woody jungle vine, which contains an MAO inhibitor, harmine, which is complexed with DMT, which comes from a plant called Psychotria viridis, chacruna. And these two plants are mixed together and boiled, and the solid fraction is eventually discarded, and the boiled fraction is concentrated tremendously, and then you get a liquid that is the equivalent of a slow-release DMT trip. And over 4 or 5 hours, you are swept into a titanically alien psychedelic experience characterized by DMT-like hallucination. Yeah, good question. Interesting question. The question is, harmine and harmaline, what's the difference? Well, both are beta-carbolines. Harmine occurs in ayahuasca. Harmine is harder to take than harmaline. Harmaline occurs in Syrian rue and is by itself a hallucinogen, and probably in the presence of cannabis, which certainly in Iran wouldn't have been a problem, it's probably quite an active hallucinogen. Harmine, the one in Banisteriopsis caapi, is a little rugged. If you actually reach hallucinatory level on it, you're fairly close to toxicity. A lot of generalizations have been made about harmaline based on harmine that we now probably should go back and look at. If you are looking for a source of if you're looking for a good MAO inhibitor source, hormal, which is the seeds of Pagaman harmala, are sold in many Iranian markets. And if you buy 2 grams of that reduced to powder and taken orally will thoroughly inhibit your MAO for 4 to 6 hours. And if you then add a tryptamine, it will not metabolize away, and you'll have a psychedelic experience of some sort. A lot of people are doing this. There's a whole movement, I don't know if you're aware, about ayahuasca analogs. In other words, finding local plants in your environment that contain MAO inhibitors and DMT, so that instead of going to the Amazon and spreading cultural death, you can, in the confines of your own kitchen, cook up a kind of ayahuasca-like thing. A lot of people are experimenting with this. There have been a few tummy aches. No, we haven't lost anybody. But this is definitely one of the frontiers of botanical consciousness. While I'm on the subject, let me, just in the interest of stirring the pot, so to speak, call your attention to, there is a new psychedelic that has been discovered that is, I believe, very destined to play a role in our future, and that is Salvia divinorum, this Mexican mint, which has a compound, it's either an isoquinoline or a sesquiterpene, not an alkaloid, that is active at the 1 milligram level. That's astonishingly intense. That's big news in pharmacology. LSD is active at 500 micrograms. That's 0.5 milligram. But LSD is a hybrid of the laboratory. This new compound called alpha salvinorine or salvinorine alpha occurs in this Mexican plant, Salvia divinorum, in quite robust amounts. I mean, it's well worth your while to extract it. It's worth your while to chew it. It's worth your while to smoke it. And, you know, the reports about this substance are pretty exciting. Even DMT test pilots come back white-knuckled from this one. As far as contraindications, you should know some people lose consciousness and get up and move around even though they're loaded. So this suggests what we call the tie 'em to the tree protocol. It only lasts about 40 minutes, so just have somebody rope you as Ulysses had his crew, rope him to the mast, and then you can hear the siren song without disgracing yourself. Yes, this is a reference to my time wave theory, which I obliquely referred to today, but didn't flay you with the details. But the nice thing about my theory is it has these hideous tests built into it that are unavoidable. You can't sweep it under the rug. And one of the tests is that the theory predicts that next year, beginning around, I believe, the end of February and on through till December, is going to be, without contest, the most dramatic plunge into novelty so far in our lifetimes. And so it has to outdo the fall of the Soviet Union. It has to even outdo Ross Perot's announcing for the presidency. There are giants that it must surpass. So I will be either here crowing a year from now, or it'll be very hard to get calls through to me as I'll be in seclusion. Yeah.
You were describing consciousness of our consciousness as being in need of a lack of individuation.
Well, it's the issue between individuation and ego. And I think your question implies a confusion of the two. I mean, we glory in our individuality, our uniqueness, our specialness. But the ego is something else. The ego is something which seeks to actually empower itself at the expense of other people. And so, there has to be a trade-off. I think the glory of Western civilization is our empowering of our uniqueness, the unique artistic vision, the unique scientific vision. The appalling thing about Western civilization is how we have, taken the worst aspects of dominator society and institutionalized it, and then passed laws which make it almost impossible to overturn it. So I'm not preaching any form of anthill, fascist or communist or otherwise, but I do think, that we over-identify ourselves with things. We over-identify our happiness with objects. One of the great things about psychedelics that is so corrosive to capitalistic values is that psychedelics show you that the best stuff is in your own head. Better than walking down Madison Avenue looking in the windows is sitting in your shabby apartment on 6 dried grams looking in the windows.
When you talk about a transcendental object, the thing that occurs to me is, let's get back to some other things you say about hypercognition or a hypercognitive object. If you go into certain states, you can see sort of like hologramic visions where your consciousness is not mediated by senses, but you're perceiving things that have holographic qualities. Could you talk about hypercognition and what the experience the shaman will sometimes have in perceiving hypercognitive beings, things like that?
Well, obviously the world arrives at the surface of your skin as one thing, and then it enters into perceptual channels of distinction. The eyes bring you some data, the ears bring you data, and the idea is that within the brain all these channels are supposed to be recombined to give you the original input. And apparently this is a culturally defined undertaking. In other words, when you think you're thinking the way people have always thought. But in fact, how people think is very much dependent on media and informational biases in the society in which they were raised. I believe most Western people hear themselves think. In other words, they hear the equivalent of a voice speaking in their head, and it speaks their thoughts. When you smoke halfway decent pot or take psychedelics or something like that, you become aware that the processing of incoming audio data shifts slightly toward the visual, and you see what people mean, or their speech seems more colorful. It seems to convey more. And I think whether we process incoming speech by the ear or by the eye internally is a cultural piece of cultural conditioning, and that in fact we are in the act of changing over. That, this generation of young people who are always dissed as illiterate are in fact print illiterate, but they know more about electronic literacy than the people who are knocking them, and their bias is primarily toward the eye rather than the ear. That's why what we really have are two cultures talking past each other. And I think that psychedelics sort of strip out culturally conditioned styles of sensory processing, and that what we call hallucinations are nothing more than our thoughts beheld to some degree, and that we're not used to beholding our thoughts. We're used to hearing our thoughts. Yeah. The question is, talk about time speeding up. Maybe we're experiencing the rapture right now. Well, in a sense, that's what I was hinting at. History is a very low-volume version of the rapture. And the 20th century is a slightly higher volume of the rapture. And, the year preceding concrescence will be yet more like the rapture, and the minutes preceding concrescence, probably hell, it will be the rapture. The universe is seeking some kind of completion at a very, very rapid state, and clearly technology is now what is driving it. For a long time it was driven by chemistry, and then 1.3 billion years ago it began to be driven by genetics. Biology became the carrier of change on this planet. 20,000 years ago, it moved into what some people call the epigenetic domain. That means change not in the genes. Writing is an epigenetic behavior. Language is an epigenetic behavior. Painting, dance, language, possibly borderline, quasi-genetic, quasi-epigenetic, as Chomsky implied. The thing that we're not coming to terms with, because it's almost literally, it's unthinkable, is that history is a birthing process. History is a very dramatic, painful, sudden episode where you begin at the top of the birth canal and you're a cheerful nomad herding your cattle across the African plains, worshiping a mother goddess, having your orgies, having your intoxications, so forth and so on. That's us at the top of the birth canal 18, 17, 16,000 years ago. Now, we are at the narrow neck, and we feel like we're being squeezed to death, suffocated there is not enough water, there is not enough air, there is only pressure, 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 pressure. And how, in this moment of cumulative global crisis, can we imagine that this is simply a passage to a wider domain of being, as different from the world we have known as this world is from the amniotic oceans of the womb? But humanness survives. I mean, humanness is fully present in the womb, fully present in the world, makes the transition through the narrow neck of the birth canal, and we will make the transition, I am confident, through the narrow neck of modern history and into this wider post-historical domain. How much of our foolishness, our religions, our prejudices, our habits we will be able to take with us into that new domain, we don't know. We'll be lucky if we get to keep the body. And I'm for that, but I'm also completely aware it may not go according to my wishes. There may come a moment when there are levels of surrender that are trying to the most crazed among us. But nature is clearly now in the third and final act of her love affair with complexity. And our cultures, our technologies now have such a momentum for the production of this kind of complexity that political decisions hardly matter anymore. That's become a sideshow, and driven by money and scientific understanding, technology has taken the lead. And by technology, I don't mean simply machines. I use McLuhan's definition. Technology is simply the extensions of man. The extensions of man. We are hardwiring the unconscious. We are shrinking the planet to a point. We are democratizing the availability of data. We are digitalizing our past so that it doesn't decay, and we are triangulating and anticipating our future and discovering it as we live into it to be more fun than we ever dared imagine, more psychedelic than we ever dared imagine. And I look for this to continue until it just reaches excruciating levels. You put it very well. We are in the shadow of the rapture that is the end of history. And this is the end of this little get-together. Thank you very much.